Welcome to session 321 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 17th of November. Today we'll be looking at Colossians 1 to 2 and Psalm 11. But first of all, let's get an overview of Colossians. Like Ephesians, Colossians is another disputed letter, with arguments over whether this was one of the last letters that Paul wrote or one of the first written by the disciples in his name. This would place it around 61 to 62 CE if written by Paul, and 61 to 71 CE if not. Unlike many of the other letters, the church in Colossae was not planted by Paul. Instead, it was planted by Epaphras, and a church that Paul had never met. Tradition has Epaphras meeting Paul in prison, and so Paul then writes this letter to encourage the Colossians. Here is a summary of the structure, but I'd recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself, particularly as today there are two. So we start with Colossians 1 to 14, greetings and prayer. Then we have 1 verses 15 to 23, the Messiah poem and reconciliation of the Colossians. Then we have 1:24 to 2 verse 5, Paul's examples. Then Colossians 2 verses 6 to 23, Jesus is enough. 3 verses 1 to 4 verses 5, the new self. And then Colossians 4 verses 5 to 18, closing thoughts. In this letter are many of the issues and ideas that we've seen in previous letters. Like many other churches, it seems that the church in Colossae were dealing with teachers that were trying to bring extra rules and instructions to make the Colossians better believers. Paul wants them to know that Jesus is enough and their faith is to be in him. He then encourages them not to be governed by rules, but by putting to death their old self and the power of sin in them and living lives shaped by Jesus. In this, he gives them things to avoid and things to pursue. He also, like Ephesians, gives them guidance on how this life might look in their households. So let's jump into today's reading, Colossians 1 to 2. Paul starts with his usual greetings and blessings and then prays for the Colossians. He thanks God to hear of the Colossians' faith in Jesus and love for fellow believers. They have heard the gospel and are living it out. It is bearing fruit in them just as it is bearing fruit in believers across the whole world. It was Epaphras who taught them the gospel and Epaphras who told Paul and his colleagues all about the Colossians' faith. Since then, Paul and his team have been praying for the Colossians that they grow in understanding and continue to lead lives worthy of Jesus. Lives that are marked by fruit and continue to be strengthened in their knowledge of God. So Paul encourages the Colossians to continue to give thanks to God for his inheritance that they have gained. And they have been rescued from darkness into God's new kingdom because of Jesus. Note Paul's language here in this introduction. He wants the Colossians to understand that they have not earned access to this new kingdom by following a set of rules. Instead, they were rescued and are now receiving an inheritance all because of Jesus. Paul then recites a hymn on the sufficiency and, like the Christ hymn we read in Philippians 2 verses 6 to 11, this hymn was likely one already familiar to the Colossians. Picking up on Genesis 1 verses 26 to 27, Paul describes Jesus as the image of God. While humanity was made to image God, Jesus is the best and most perfect image. Paul also calls him the firstborn of all creation. That's Colossians 1 to 15. This has caused some to assume that Jesus was therefore created, but that's not what firstborn means here. Let's look at a few Old Testament examples. In Psalm 89 verse 27, we see God making David the firstborn. Israel is described as God's firstborn son in Exodus 4 verse 22, and Ephraim is described as God's firstborn son in Jeremiah 31 verse 8. Physically speaking, none of these were firstborns. David had 7 older brothers. Israel, also known as Jacob, was second to his brother Esau, and Ephraim was second to his brother Manasseh. The term firstborn was regularly used to describe a special status, not a literal firstborn. In fact, it was through Jesus that all things were created and continue to find their being. Not only was he the source of creation, but he continues to be the source of new creation. He is the head of the church and the first one to die and be resurrected so that all can die and find new life in him. The fullness of God is found in Jesus, and through Jesus, all creation is being reconciled back to God. Turning back to the Colossians, Paul describes them as being one estranged from God and hostile in the mind. They used to practice evil, but now they are being reconciled to Jesus in his body and continue to be so if they hold on to their faith. They should not shift their hope to some other means of being right before God. Their hope should be in this gospel. Paul then points to the example of his own life. He describes his suffering as completing what is lacking in Christ's afflictions. That's Colossians 1 verse 24. This isn't to say that what Jesus did was not enough, but that Paul is participating in the suffering of Jesus to make it real for the Colossians and other believers at the time. Each generation and group need Jesus embodied for them in the form of other believers. Paul has become a servant and participated in suffering because of this very gospel, that all hope is found in Jesus, even for Gentiles. It is Jesus that Paul teaches about, and he will continue to work and struggle to get that message out there. The Colossians, along with the church in Laodicea and many others, have never met Paul, but he writes to them in the hope that he might encourage them through his struggles. And he writes that they might know the power of the gospel that he shares and not be persuaded by any other gospel that argues something different. So Paul encourages the Colossians in their faith. He tells them to continue living in Jesus, just as when they first received him. The Colossians are to be rooted and built upon Jesus. They are to avoid anyone who tries to get them to live according to set traditions or cultural expectations. They are empty traditions of men and are in line with the elemental spirits of the universe. That's Colossians 2 verse 9. We saw Paul use similar language in Galatians 4 verse 3. These elemental spirits are the forces of sin and darkness in the world. And the Colossians need to know that it's only in Jesus that the fullness of God dwells, and in him that they meet with God. They were circumcised, but with a spiritual circumcision that involved dying to themselves and being raised to life in Jesus. All sin that came from breaking the law has been forgiven and satisfied. It was nailed to the cross. And Jesus also won a victory over the powers of sin and darkness. Therefore, because the law is satisfied and the Colossians are now free in Jesus, they should not allow anyone to bring in new or old laws that will bring condemnation, whether that be what you should eat and drink, what festivals you should observe, or how to keep the Sabbath. These were clearly the rules and teachings that were being taught to the Colossians. These things were useful in the past because they pointed to Jesus, but now the Colossians have Jesus himself. Paul then encourages the Colossians to reject other teachings, self-abasement, worship of angels, and dwelling on visions. There's some debate what each of these means, but either way, Paul describes them as puffing up caused by human ways of thinking. They made those who do them feel self-important when really they have not held to Jesus, who is the one that is both the head and body of believers, and the thing that holds them all together. He is the ligaments and the sinews of the body as well as its. So Paul gives a final warning to the Colossians. Jesus died to defeat the powers of sin and darkness, to satisfy the laws they had weaponized against creation. Why then would the Colossians try to live in a way that satisfies these laws themselves as though they were still under them? These rules seem good as they enforce on those who do them a sense of humility, but they don't actually shape the state of one's heart. Only Jesus can do that. But that is Colossians 1 to 2. Now let's look at Psalm 11. This psalm is attributed to King David and fits into the category of trust psalm. These psalms sing of confidence of who God is. Here's a summary of the structure. We start with verse 1, the Lord is our refuge. Verses 2 to 3, false claims are what happens to the righteous and the wicked. Verse 4, the Lord rules on high. Verses 5 to 6, the truth on what happens to the righteous and the wicked. And then verse 7, the Lord is righteous. The psalmist is clearly going through some struggles because they feel the need to take refuge in the Lord. But the focus isn't on those struggles, it's firmly on God. So much so that he challenges the claims of others who tell him to flee because their enemies are preparing to take them out. He challenges the ideas that the wicked are the ones in control and that the righteous have no foundations or strengths to stand on. God is on the throne. He sees all things. He is in control, not the wicked. Yes, he might test the righteous to see if they are true, but it is the wicked he will punish and deal with. God is righteous, and he will take care of those who are upright before him. In Psalm 9 and 10, we saw two different ways of bringing God our problems. Start with praise or end with praise. Psalm 11 gives us a third option. Sometimes it's not even worth giving our problems the time of day. Instead, we are better off just grounding ourselves in the foundation of the goodness of God. In these situations, our prayers are praise all the way through. Having looked at these three psalms, you may feel like there's a particular route you prefer, and that's fine. But make sure you don't completely ignore the other two. Each one is beneficial in its different way. If you decide you're only ever going to praise, then your heart never really gets to lament. But by the same token, spend too much time on lament and you lose the will to praise. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.